a young perspective on hot-button issues around the world. This is The Hub.
China's economy has just hit a major milestone, that is according to official statistics. On January the 19th, the National Bureau of Statistics of China announced that in 2025, China's GDP surpassed 114 trillion yuan, that is over 20 trillion US dollars, growing 5% year-on-year in real terms. It is the first time the economy of China has crossed this threshold. With this performance, the 14th five-year plan officially wraps up. So how was this growth achieved? What hurdles had to be overcome? And what does this milestone mean for China's long-term trajectory as China steps into its 15th five-year plan? To explore all these questions and more, we're joined in Jakarta, Indonesia by Bert Hoffman, non-resident senior fellow at the East Asian Institute at the National University of Singapore. In Shenzhen, China, we have Andy Mock, senior fellow at the Center for China and Globalization. And in our Beijing studio, we have Professor Liu Baocheng, Dean of the Center for International Business Ethics at the University of International Business and Economics. So, Bert, let me turn to you first. 140 trillion yuan, that is over 20 trillion US dollars, marking the first time China's economy crossing this mark, growing 5% year-on-year. That is consistent with China's annual growth target. What do you make of these statistics?
So it's good that China achieved its goal of 5% growth, but there is some concern if you look at the fourth quarter that there is a bit of a loss of momentum. So going into next year, we need to see whether growth can be maintained. Second, if you look at the composition of growth, on the one hand, domestic demand held up quite well. Consumption demand held up quite well. But what is quite remarkable is a reduction in investment. In fixed asset investment was actually negative growth. Capital formation was still positive and still contributed to growth, but less so than in previous years. The real demand growth came from external demand. And that, to some extent, is of a concern because China's large trade surpluses do raise issues in other countries, in the United States, in Europe, but also in developing economies.
Andy, what do you make of the headwinds, for example, the concerns of the recipient countries of Chinese goods and services, with which China has a huge surplus? China is becoming, has been the world's largest trading nation, and this year more so. Versus the tailwinds of the Chinese economy, the grain sector, the high-tech sector, AI, robotics, so on and so forth. What do you make of Chinese data?
Well, Wang Guan, I think, again, this is a historic milestone, not only China's achievement in its overall economy, but the record trade surplus as well. With that being said, I think we have to be a little bit careful here in that this number might not be as helpful as it seems. Something like saying 5 apples minus 3 oranges equals 2 pomegranates. And it's accurate in a certain way, but it also, I think, misleads in a certain way as well. So let me focus on a number that I think is more important, which is China's exports, which was about 3.7 trillion US dollars. And it was about, I think, a 5% growth rate year over year. And what this means is that it is not China, it's not a flood of Chinese goods being unleashed on the world, or it's not China pushing its goods on the world, but it is millions, hundreds of millions of individuals, businesses, even governments voting with their own money, making rational choices, saying they are choosing Chinese products over alternatives. So I think this is very important to recognize. And the second is that there's a lot of talk is how sustainable is this? And I agree that there are political challenges. But if we look at it from the perspective of total global GDP, which is about 110, 115 trillion US dollars, this only represents about 3% of total global economic activity. And I think what this tells us is as China continues to lead in design, not just manufacturing, is shifting to advanced manufacturing techniques. And as you mentioned, some of these industries are the future, sustainability, servers, all the physical infrastructure for artificial intelligence, et cetera. That I wouldn't be surprised at all if we were looking at double or even triple the amount of Chinese exports, in 10 years or so. Because again, China's only getting better. I think customers, businesses all around the world are increasingly, the default is China. whether you're looking at less high-tech goods to now even some of the most high-tech goods in the world, like electric vehicles, say. So I think, again, this is a very positive sign for China, and the narrative around this record trade surplus being unsustainable might not be as helpful as I think some in the West are framing it.
Thanks for these great insights. Now, Professor Liu, how do you interpret China's GDP figures for the year 2025?
I think this is really a milestone when the world achieved an average of 3.2 or 3.3. For a global type of economy of China to achieve 5% is really phenomenal in that given the two very important issues. One would be the global turbulence in terms of the disruption over the supply chain and more of the uncertainties with major trading partners in tariff and other non-tariff barriers. And domestically, we are also experiencing rapid transformation in our industrial structure, and some of the resistance are still there because of the past dependence or some sort of different ideas. But we managed that, and now the consumption is rapidly recovering. And even though we are facing some of the headwinds domestically in terms of the real estate sector, the local debt issues, we did really achieve quite a great deal through one would be the innovation-driven economy. It's not only the skill, but rather also the technology intensity that is there to translate from concept more into industrial might. And the other would be the green transformation. So this is something that's there to make a very delicate balance between economic growth and efficiency versus environmental quality. But overall, I really give a thumbs up for such a sort of wonderful achievement.
Right, Professor, thanks for these insights. Now, let's talk about the export, which has been one of the highlights of the Chinese growth. Now, the total value of China's imports and exports exceeded 45 trillion yuan, up 3.8% year on year. And if you just look at export, it is even higher. So this 3.8% figure is really neutralized by the fact that China has been exporting a lot more than it imports, with a trade surplus surpassing 1 trillion US dollars, the de facto and de jure trading nation of the world. Bert, you have been talking about a very important issue that is the concerns of some countries who have concerns over Chinese exports. Now, how sustainable do you think China's trade and export momentum can be sustained in the year 2026?
Well, let me be very clear. As an economist, you would say, look, surpluses or deficits, they really are dependent on national savings and investment imbalances. And so China saves more than it invests, and therefore it has an export surplus, and the rest of the world benefits from that. In a perfect world, there is no issue. But in a political world, there are issues because surpluses or deficits, politicians see lost jobs and they see lost opportunities for manufacturing and industrial development. So that's a developing country concerns. In some of the West, and particularly in Europe, they see national security concerns because a lost industry means that you can no longer build the stuff that you need to defend yourself. So those are the political concerns that are currently playing. From an economic point of view, I believe that China's current surpluses are the result of really long-term thinking and industrial policy that started in the mid-2000s that are now that China is now reaping the benefits of.
Well, let me add something to that.
Go ahead, Professor Liu.
I think the aggressive Chinese export is not really artificial deliberation, but rather it's really the operation of the market mechanism around the globe. And, people are talking about only on statistical figures, whether the trade balance or not, but rather if you look at the two directions China has been exporting, one would be for those global South countries. Actually, we are not really exporting more of the consumer goods, but we're exporting increasingly those machineries and solar panels, etc. That actually is is there to help them to build the foundation of their industrial capacity instead of killing their own industry, because some of the countries, they don't have that type of industries. The other would be, going to Europe, for example. We are really providing strategic raw materials and the components that really also is there to help them to build their own industrial capacity on an upper level, and so that that's there to contribute to the stability of the global supply chain. So do not simply just look at those, the imbalance in terms of figures. Yes, China does really want to, enlarge its imports, and we have already alleviated a number of tariff barriers with so many other countries. For a particular example is that last year we totally offered the zero-free tariff for 53 countries in Africa. So this is something that China has been doing.
Well, Bert, don't you think, Professor Liu has a point whereby we have been seeing diverging attitudes towards Chinese exports? ASEAN, where you are right now, Jakarta, the seat of ASEAN, seems to be more welcoming of Chinese exports, whereas in the U.S.-led Western world, the attitudes are very different.
So I think it's a very good point. And one of the benefits of China's continued rise in the world stage is that China is now a major investor in the country I live in Indonesia, but all around Southeast Asia. China's become an important investor, and not just in infrastructure, but also in manufacturing. So that's entirely welcome. I mentioned the other issues. The issues are also raised with China's domestic policies that have a tendency to create a lot of capacity and an enormous competition. And if there is not sufficient domestic demand, that spills over on world markets. China has a very effective industrial policy, but it's also quite a large industrial policy. The IMF has estimated that about 5% of GDP is invested every year in industrial policy. The question is whether that is compatible with WTO standards. And look, the WTO is not functioning at the moment, so it's hard to find out. But those are the concerns that other countries are raising. And I think that those can be discussed.
Right. Andy, let me turn to Andy. Yeah, you have anything to add?
Well, I was just going to say, I definitely do not dismiss these economic perspectives, but I think it really is important to emphasize that it's not really Chinese subsidies or long-term planning that is the main reason why China's running the surplus and why exports have grown so much. They certainly help. But again, we have to remember these are individuals, families, companies, and even governments, I think as Professor Liu said, that are buying not just end products, but components from China. So we could have the best policies in the world, enormous subsidies, but if the actual producers and business people cannot produce cost-competitive, high-quality, well-designed products delivered on time and on spec, none of this will matter. So I think this is very important to point out that this, I think is a very, very important reason. And the political response around the world is maladaptive, meaning we look at, governments are there to represent, serve the interest of their citizens. And many countries, the United States in particular, is facing inflation, affordability crises. And what is the right solution? It is cost-effective, high-quality goods from China. And the proper political response, I would say, the rational political response, is not to try to stop this, but have the right policies to shift labor, to address your national security needs in other ways. That I think this is, kind of, I hate to put it this way, but somewhat a simple-minded and very ineffective response to economic reality.
Yeah, I want to move on to one thing that is really the hallmark of the Chinese growth recently, new productive forces. That has been central to China's economic planning and the Chinese agenda. If you look at the 15th five-year plan, which couldn't emphasize enough the importance of biochemistry, AI, robotics, the high-tech industries, green growth, so on and so forth. So how do you think China has fared when it comes to the new quality productive forces, Professor Liu?
I think under the general framework of high quality growth, the new protective forces has been gaining quite a momentum. It's not really something that we can really brag about from the lab work, but rather to translate those high technologies into practical industrial spectrum. This is something that's highly commendable. The output can be, those e-vehicles, new energy batteries, and drones, etc. So it's really the scale combined with efficiency supported by innovation that makes China extremely competitive. We already see that so many households have really benefit a great deal, but more importantly, it is really the industrial world that's there to benefit far more with the government policy to support the trade-in program of major companies. And now there are so many factories that you do not really see any assembly lines that are operated by so many workers anymore, and also the precision, efficiency, and the skill that are being produced. That something make China not only in terms of the competitiveness with regard to the volume, but more in the quality. And that also explains why China's export surplus has been hitting the hallmark of such a size, because there's more added value component within that. So now China is generous enough to be willing to share more of those technologies and operational mechanism with more of the global South countries, and so that we are able to diversify our market and strengthen our global supply chain. Over a global platform rather than concentrating on Chinese own domestic marketplace.
Bert, there has always been this concern about consumption, household consumption, dragging the growth of the Chinese economy. The Chinese are saving way more than they consume. Although at the end of the year data showing that the Chinese household consumption holds up somewhat, do you think these headwinds can be somewhat neutralized by the high-quality productive forces, for example, the application of AI across sectors, something that China boasts?
So, look, I think over time, China's changing growth model will help, but a lot needs to be done. If you think about the past, China's growth model has been very capital intensive, a lot of investment that made China catch up very, very quickly. But it also means that basically in the distribution, you need to pay a lot for capital, and therefore the household share in the economy is not as big as you want it to be. Now, with new quality productive forces, with high quality growth, you will see a reduction of the share of capital in growth. And last year was actually the first year where you saw total factor productivity increase. The question is, how do these benefits, these productivity increase benefits, how are they going to be distributed, and how will they come to the household so that their share in the economy will increase, and that will drive consumption, which is a much more stable base than, say, exports or even investment as a basis for demand. So that's a big question. And policies such as expanding the social safety net, providing more public services, expanding public infrastructure, and then how the services sector is going to be developed are all critical questions that are going to be addressed in the 15th five-year plan.
Andy, what do you think? I mean, the real estate sector has been steadily declining since 2021. If you look at property prices and related industries across the industry chains, and also the consumption levels, whereby the Chinese are saving hundreds of billions of RMB into their bank accounts, depositing rather than consuming. How do you see these issues be resolved?
Yeah, that's a great question, Wang Guan. So I would say, first of all, we have to understand what exactly is going on with this real estate problem. And it's often defined as an accident. So it's a crisis that no one wanted. I would say it's probably better to think of it as surgery, or maybe open heart surgery. Very, very serious, but very deliberate as well. And of course, not without risk. because I think it was well recognized that, this old growth model had reached its limits and China needed to transition to a new one. And it wouldn't be easy. And again, it's not without risk and not without cost. So I think we have to recognize that, first of all. And second, while things have not turned around yet, it'll may take a while, but it is contained. And I think this is very different from we've seen other financial crises around the world that spread a contagion to other parts of the economy. I think that this is very contained. The other thing about consumption, I would say, is we first have to be very careful. What are we comparing against? And I think smuggled into a lot of this conversation, or a lot of these conversations, are the U.S. model with this large percentage of consumption is somehow the right thing to do. And I think if we look at it a little more closely, I think most reasonable people would agree that the U.S. consumption, way of consumption and the volume of consumption is actually quite toxic. And I think is a sign of malaise rather than economic health. So I think that's the first point. Second is that, as you said, Wang Guan, it's not that the Chinese consumer, and this is also reported in the Western media, that consumer wealth has been erased by the real estate problem, as if, all this wealth went away. But the reality is that, as you mentioned, Chinese households are sitting on something like 22 trillion US dollars, in household savings that they could spend, but are not spending. So this is a fortress of cash. And whether they should go out and spend a lot more, I think is hard to say. But I think what is true is that consumer sentiment in China today absolutely is very cautious. But at the same time, you do see, if you go around the malls, certain places, business is booming. Restaurants, you have to wait an hour plus to get a table, and obviously some are struggling. So the market opportunity is there. Consumers have the spending power. And I would not say that, it's really the situation is as dire as many people seem to believe. And I would also say, to end, Wang Guan, is that I'm not really sure that increasing consumption materially is really such a good thing. And I don't think this is what the government is looking to accomplish, frankly.
Right, good points. Now, expanding domestic demand and building a strong domestic market remain two very important strategic priorities. So, Professor Liu, which institutional reforms or improvements to the market environment do you think are critical to unlock consumption and investment potential, especially from the private sector?
Well, I think the continued support of the private sector by paving the level playing field between different market players, for example, the private companies, state-owned ones, and foreign invested ones, would be something continually important in bringing about the cost-effective supply. The second would be to streamline some of the institutional hurdles, particularly those, the barriers across different regions between urban area versus the rural area. So that can also reduce the cost, not only in monetary terms, but also in time-wise, in terms of uncertainty. And the other is that to provide stable employment as the predictions for most of the workforce, but particularly for the younger generation, is something that can really strengthen their confidence for the household spending.
Can I interrupt here, Professor Liu, because youth unemployment is a huge issue, or youth employment. Let's be more optimistic here. We have friends, I have young friends around me, millennials, Gen Z, they're trying very hard. Some of them are scrambling to find a job, let's face it. So in light of China's changing economic landscape, what will the future of work look like, and where can be areas of opportunity for these young peoples, job seekers, fresh out of college or vocational schools going forward?
I think the entrepreneurship would be something that's continued to provide a large window of opportunity for those people, but they must be prepared not only by themselves, but we also need to reform our educational system so that they get more catered, not only with the update in knowledge, but rather more of the hands-on experience dealing with the complexity of the world, but with a great promise for transformation. And the other is that the private sectors also need to be taking into consideration that by hiring those high-quality people, they can really move further in their competitiveness. And also, the government needs also to give the right to type of support to streamline some of the hurdles in the employment policies on the individual companies, and also, more importantly, to make sure that given there's more of the encouraging policies for the enlarging our birth rate, that's something that more of the gender equity, particularly in favor of the women, is something that can be highly implemented. But most importantly, it's really the legal structure. It's not only something written on the paper, but on the judicial system in terms of transparency and efficiency must have to be enhanced to give people the right confidence and predictable picture that they will move forward to.
Gentlemen, thank you so much for your insights. We learned a lot. And that will do it for this edition of The Hub on CGTN. Thank you for tuning in. Our news coverage continues. Bye and take care.